Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and of course James Holland. James, who are we talking to today? This is a sort of this is a super match game, isn't it?
Yeah. This is history royalty today. We've got one of the biggest names in the game. It's Andrew Roberts. You know, he started off writing about Halifax some years ago.
Yeah.
He's been biographer of many notable people. He's written about leadership in war. He's written a single volume history of the Second World War, the Storm of War. But today we're here to talk to him about Churchill walking with destiny. And friend of the show, Dominic Sandbrook, of course, on our sister podcast, claims it's the best single volume biography ever of Churchill. And who could possibly argue with Dominic? And I would agree, it's an absolutely fabulous biography. And interestingly, Andrew, you were able, unlike other people, you were able to get access to sources that no one else before had seen for your work.
I was, yes. It's very exciting, as you know, to be able to get into a new source. And I was very fortunate that the Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries. So I was able to use King George VI diaries, and he met Churchill every Tuesday of the Second World War. They had an audience together over lunch. Nobody else was allowed to. They served themselves from the sideboard because nobody else could be allowed to be there because of what they were talking about. Because they were talking about the most secret things of the Second World War. They talked about the ultra secret. They talked about the nuclear bomb. They talked about which generals were going to be hired and fired, and admirals and ministers and so on. And so clearly nobody else could be present.
Gosh.
Absolutely amazing. And what were his diaries like? I mean,
that was my immediate thought. You know, are they two kippers for breakfast?
No, fortunately not. No, actually, you're quite right, actually, because, of course, his father, George V, had a lot of things about the weather. You know, he would start off saying which direction. He was a classic sailor in that sense, you know, which direction the wind was blowing and so on. But no, George VI, fortunately, was much more interested in politics and in the war and in Churchill as well. You see, they didn't start off as friends at all. No. Churchill was was in favour of Edward VIII during the abdication crisis. He supported him, and of course George VI was a keen appeaser. So they could. There's a chance that they wouldn't get on, but in fact they did get on wonderfully, very quickly. And he was the only one of the king's four prime ministers who the king referred to and spoke to using his Christian name.
Isn't that interesting? And I mean, Churchill had this enormous capacity for disarming people, didn't he? But would you say that George VI shared that as well? I think
you probably have that if you're King of England anyway, don't you? There's a sort of you've got a bit of a head start when it comes to disarming people. I think he had he was good natured and a decent man and upstanding and all of those good things, and turned out, of course, to be a king 20 times better than his brother would have been and had been. So I think in that sense, the Churchill came round very quickly to appreciating his qualities.
Did Churchill go into that thinking, right, I need to make an effort here, I've got to court the king, or did he go into it thinking he's just going to have to take me as I am? This is too big an emergency for us to get bogged down in our personalities.
Actually, I know this is a terrible answer ever to give, but there was a little bit of both in it, really. He did understand the importance, of course, the constitutional importance of the Prime Minister and the King getting on, but he was responsible for a bit of lèse-majesté in that he sometimes turned up late to audiences. If there was a cabinet meeting about something very important that was going on, he would sometimes actually even postpone the whole meeting, and so, which the king did not like, or at least the king didn't seem to mind, but the courtiers didn't like it at all. They thought that was unacceptable behaviour. But if there's issues as serious and essentially as existential as the ones of 1940, of course he had to take decisions in the Defence Committee of the War Cabinet rather than going off to Buckingham Palace.
Yeah.
And Andrew, obviously you've written Halifax's biography as well. Whenever people ask me about, what do you think was the kind of worst moment of the war for Britain, I would say, well, the closest I think they came to kind of throwing in the towel was Monday, the 27th of May, 1940. And I wonder what your take is on those kind of 5 days in May and the kind of war cabinet machinations that were going on. You know, do you open peace feelers with the Italians? Do you not? You know, what's going on with Dunkirk at the moment and Operation Dynamo? The famous walk in the garden between Churchill and Halifax. What on earth they said. I mean, what's your view on all this?
Well, I rather agree with you. I mean, I think we could quibble about maybe it was the 26th of May, owing to the fact that we got 50,000 men back from Dunkirk on the 27th. But nonetheless, it was certainly that week. Of course, you're right. And Lord Halifax was interested in speaking to the Italians. We know a little later on that Rab Butler, Halifax's number 2 at the Foreign Office, actually was criticising Churchill and said to the Swedish ambassador that thought rather than bravado would dictate the policy of the King's government. You know, there was an incredibly undermining statement to make about the Prime Minister at a time so extremely dangerous. Sorry, common sense and not bravado. And so yes, there were elements in the government that would have done a peace deal with Hitler. And just imagine the consequences of that, the way in which the Americans would have recognised that we could no longer be used or couldn't be used as any kind of a springboard for the liberation of the continent, what it would do to demoralisation in Britain, just essentially handing the whole of Western Europe over forever to the Nazis. It would have been absolutely catastrophic for us.
And he also plays a good hand with Chamberlain, doesn't he? I've always felt that his handling of Chamberlain, having taken over as Prime Minister, was really masterful. Kind of allowing Chamberlain to stay in number 10, being incredibly gracious to him, kind of just sort of gently but firmly kind of winning him over. And arguably that makes a bit of an impact on that crucial week of the 26th, 27th of May.
It certainly does. And also, yes, one has to remember that Chamberlain doesn't support Halifax in that, even though they've been tremendously close politically for the previous 3 years. He supports Churchill in wanting to continue to fight on. He handled him incredibly deftly. And I think you can see in that wonderful speech, one of Churchill's greatest speeches was the funeral oration at Westminster Abbey.
Yes, it's amazing, isn't it?
For Chamberlain, in which he says words which every historian should read, apart from anything else, about the nature of honour and the nature of reputation and the nature of history, frankly, you know, in that amazing speech. And it does sum up the way he recognised the great patriotism that Chamberlain showed in sort of not throwing in the towel, even though he was suffering from cancer from July 1940 onwards and knew it, you know, but he stayed in post until October.
Yeah,
one of the things Churchill has to do during that time, though, is essentially re-engage with Conservative Party politics, doesn't he? Because he's not been properly engaged as a party. He's been opposing the party for a good decade, hasn't he? Picking his issues, creating his own political space, depending on how you look at it, you know. And so that period after May, you know, once the crisis of Dunkirk has passed and it's clear what Britain's part or trajectory or planned trajectory is, to stay in the war, to hang on in there, to carry on, he has to re-engage politically, doesn't he, with the party? Because after all, he's not party leader, and that's a difficult time for Churchill in that respect, isn't it?
Very difficult, and this is where Chamberlain, who was party leader until his death, could have caused an awful lot of trouble. And there were people in the party who said that Churchill shouldn't become party leader, and that he should stay as the national figure and look at Lloyd George in the Great War and so on. And so there was a sort of dangerous precedent really there for him. But he recognised that would have been potentially suicidal, especially if things went wrong, or come the end of the war if they just wanted to dump him. So he very much recognised that you had to be party leader in order to get through that kind of crisis. And he, as you say, he very much had to realign his whole political stance of being essentially anti the Tory party establishment to actually being its leader. And a lot of the people in the Tory party establishment, a lot of the people in the 1922 committee, in the actual voluntary wing of the Conservative Party, on their committees and so on, just couldn't stand Churchill. They thought of him as an enemy for 30 plus years, who had been a Liberal for 20 years, and who was wrong on a large number of issues and so on. They thought he was an interloper and entirely untrustworthy. I think in modern day politics with the Tory party there are a few parallels there.
I mean, who travelled the furthest, him or the party, to make up that gap? I mean, obviously, the fortunes of war blew one way and another, and I mean, you, as you say, he has to be leader in case anything goes wrong, and then things do then go very, very wrong, and they carry on going wrong really for well into 1942. Does he travel furthest back to the party? Does the party come to him?
They're both. The third or so of Tory MPs, I think, perhaps in any generation, who are essentially careerists and most interested in getting on in life and in the world and in the party and in politics, recognise that he is in charge and they better start moving towards him, which they do. The dyed-in-the-wool appeasers essentially also move towards him, at least in that they shut up, they don't undermine him. A few Tory MPs, actually, you mentioned 1942, even in that confidence motion, actually do support no confidence in his government, but very, very few compared to the 400 plus who don't. And then you also have this very much this sense of there not being any obvious alternative leader. Halifax has gone to America, been sent off as ambassador to America. Anthony Eden's too young, and anyway, he's considered on the Churchillian anti-appeasing side of the party. Sir Kingsley Wood dies of a heart attack fairly soon, and then the other people are, like the old members of the Chamberlain cabinet are either too old or too attached to appeasement to be a threat. So there isn't an obvious sort of figure. Leo Amery isn't considered to be a sort of leadership candidate. If there was somebody, he'd have been in a lot of trouble. And when one thinks of the way in which people like Beaverbrook and Ernie Bevin even are thought of as alternative, Stafford Cripps at one point, alternative prime ministers in the Second World War, he was very fortunate that there wasn't one obviously waiting in the wings in the Tory party.
I mean, what's interesting about this is in the broad brush conception, people don't think that there's party politicking going on during the Second World War. We all pull together and plough the same furrow together. Whereas in fact, all this stuff is all this business as usual, really. This sort of stuff, and I think some listeners will be surprised that there were no confidence motions. That even happened, I think, would strike some people as extraordinary.
Yes, but doesn't it show that, in a sense, it's the strength of British democracy that in the middle of a world war, you can do it that.
Absolutely. That's exactly it. But I think people might not realise quite that there is this sort of motion and churn going on. And after all, at the end of it all, there's a general election to be fought once the dust has settled, and there's domestic politics as well to sort of to shake through, and the deal you've got to make with a conscripted army and navy and air force, that in the end you've got to offer them something, because that's arguably the disaster of the First World War, is that the franchise wasn't enough.
That's right. And also the other thing they looked at in the First World War was, of course, with the Asquith being brought down by Lloyd George and Lord Northcliffe and various other important figures, and then the the fact that the Squiffites, the Asquithians, never came round to the national government, and the problems that came as a result of that, which spilled over obviously into peacetime, the people were very worried that that was going to happen as well. And people often forget, of course, that in fact the national government ended in May 1945 rather than at the time of the general election in July 1945. You know, it was a Conservative Party that was around in the last part of the Second World War, prior to the defeat of Japan, obviously. And so, you know, politics did go on as usual. In fact, what James mentioned earlier about Chamberlain was tremendously important, because if he had not died, it would have been him who was the key figure in the home, the whole organisation of the Home Front, which actually, of course, was taken on by Clement Attlee as Deputy Prime Minister after Chamberlain's death. But up to that point, it was Chamberlain. He was immensely conservative, far to the right, essentially, if you can use those kind of expressions, than Churchill. Whereas Attlee was to the left. So you get Beveridge and so on as a result of Attlee being the key figure on the Home Front in a way that would not have happened if Chamberlain hadn't died of cancer.
Fascinating. Gosh. Now, the thing, I mean, you're walking with destiny. This is the one of the things about Winston Churchill, of course, is that, and you know, he wrote, I'm going to write the history. It'll be kind to me. All that stuff. How do you, when you're approaching him as a biographer, how do you disentangle this man who styles himself as a man of destiny from the idea that he is a man of destiny? Because that's you know, he casts such a gigantic shadow, and did, you know, arguably, I mean, it's Lord Hailsham, isn't he, said that Churchill proves the existence of God, doesn't he? That Churchill's there in the right place, right time. You know, to get caught in the sort of romance of those ideas as a historian must be quite. You've got to sort of watch yourself, haven't you, and remain hygienic.
I think that's a very good word for it. I think one's got to remember that actually somebody who believes in their own destiny, that they have a sort of God-given place in the world to save Britain and save London, save the empire, and so on. I mean, that is a prima facie case of a psychological disorder, isn't it?
Yes,
you know, and yet there was no other way of subtitling that book, because when he's 16 years old, he tells his best friend at school, Merland Evans, that there will be a time when great struggles and great battles will take place, and I shall step forward and save England and the Empire. He says, you know, and Merland Evans would have had every right, at, you know, age 16 at Harrow, to have laughed at him just like we have. But then 50 years later, he goes and does exactly that, you know, and so this sense of destiny, which I argue in the book, comes from not just this idea of him, of what he was like when he was 16, but also the things that happened to him, especially the extraordinary number of close brushes with death, which he survives. Not just the military ones, but
airplane crashes and so
2 airplane crashes, 3 car crashes, nearly drowns. He knocks himself out for a week. He has a terrible, the time he nearly dies, most dangerous really, except for on a battlefield, was when he got pneumonia aged 11 and very nearly died on that occasion. The doctors prescribed him brandy, both orally and rectally. Which you would have thought might have put you off brandy for life, don't you think? But nonetheless, it certainly didn't. It was quite the opposite in his case, certainly. And there were loads of others. He was involved in a house fire at one stage. You know, he was nearly he was run over in New York, very nearly killed by a car on Fifth Avenue and 76th Street. So, and as I say, that doesn't even take into account the five campaigns he fought on 4 continents, where bullets were whizzing past his head. There's one moment when he said that to be shot at without result is one of the great exhilarating moments in life. There's nothing more exhilarating, he said, than to be shot at without result. And he was shot at without result a great deal, and people around him were actually hit. His brother, in one occasion, any number of people in the First World War. There's one moment where he left a dugout, and 5 minutes later a German whiz-bang came and decapitated everyone inside. And that was the moment where he said he thought that invisible wings were beating over him.
Well, his time on the Western Front is a very interesting episode in his life, isn't it? Because some see it as, his critics see it as a sort of essentially performative moment where his political career has ended in failure. So he dresses up as a poilu. He takes his hamper with him, and goes to be a battalion commander on the Western Front. And there is that sense with, because in March 45, when he's trying to take part in the Varsity Rhine crossing, there's some people around him who think he's trying to get himself killed, because that would be the perfect way to end the story. As he's crossed the Rhine, he's killed by enemy shellfire or sniper, and the chapter is perfectly closed as a warlord. But when he goes to the Somme, he's doing it quite seriously, isn't he? As you say, a whiz-bang is taking out positions around him. It's not a performative thing, or is it both? Because it's Churchill.
I think anyone who criticises him for performative art, as you say, has got to have actually gone into no man's land no fewer than 30 times on trench raids, at the dead of night, gone through the barbed wire, got so close to the Germans that they could hear them speaking in their trenches, and so on. If you've done that, then you can criticise Winston Churchill.
Yeah. Well, no, because the thing about one of the things about Churchill, of course, is because he is such a sort of, he's a touchstone for lots of people, for the people who really like him and the people who really don't like him, and very often those things are performative in themselves, aren't they? That saying you think Churchill's a rotter is, for some kinds of people, is a very important flag to run up your flagpole, isn't it?
And more and more, of course, in the woke era. I mean, he's hated by the ultra woke, and lots of books are being written. There's another one I'm just about to review in the Spectator this week, in fact, and there was one by Geoffrey Wheatcroft a few weeks ago. You get them more and more often. In fact, they all start saying Churchill is worshipped and admired, but nobody knows the other side to him. And you think, what do you mean nobody knows the other side? All the books at the moment are so critical of him that everyone. The only reason you don't know the other side is if you're completely illiterate. That's what's.
Well, I must admit, I've always just thought how very fortunate it was for we in the democracies in the Second World War, that the two largest political leaders, the most important political leaders in the West, Roosevelt and Churchill, had such enormous geopolitical understanding, whereas the dictators obviously didn't. I mean, you're hard pushed to find someone with less geopolitical understanding than Mussolini, and Hitler's kind of running a close second, I'd have thought.
Well, because the dictators are also men of destiny, and have also told their best friends that there's going to be a crisis to come, and they're going to save and change the world. I mean, which is after all Hitler's pitch, isn't it? Is that
absolutely, but they don't share that geopolitical understanding. No. They don't have that worldliness. They don't have that kind of big vision in the same way that Roosevelt and Churchill do. And I think,
there's a drawback with this. I think this stance, James, which is, of course, that is Stalin. It's not very fashionable at the moment to say anything terribly pro-Russian, but they lost 27 million killed in the Second World War under Stalin, and he didn't have a great geopolitical sense, because otherwise he wouldn't have signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But he certainly had a very strong sense of where Russia's ultimate interests and to use that word again, destiny lay. And had it not been for Stalin, who essentially killed 4 out of 5 of every Germans who were killed in combat, not bombed from the air, but killed in combat on battlefields in the Second World War, we couldn't have won. Yes, you're right about having these two extraordinary leaders of the democracies, but actually also having somebody who did not buckle and was not defeated in the East, even though he was a totalitarian dictator as bad as Hitler.
Well, yes. I suppose my whole point about that is it depends on what angle you're looking at. I mean, I've been reading you and I, Al, have both been reading David Starr recently. He makes a very convincing case that Germany was not well equipped for Barbarossa in the first place, either economically or in terms of manpower or in terms of pretty much anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always argued that the war in the East was lost to Germany by autumn of 1941, and I think it was. But you also have to understand that one has to understand, of course, that economically it was the West that smashed Germany, not the East. What was it, 7% on 4% or something on Panzers and 43% on Luftwaffe in 1943.
Yeah. Well, and the Americans building 2.5 million trucks, half of which go to the Soviets. So I mean, that sort of stuff.
But my bigger point was just that from a Western point of view of sort of managing the war and how you fight it in an efficient way which reduces the number of our own young lives being killed, that harnessing of air, land, sea power, of understanding the importance of the oceans, of how you harness big industry, all the rest of it. Ultimately, the ultimate arbitrators of that are Roosevelt and Churchill. And I think they do that fantastically well. And they see that kind of big vision of how the world works and the place in it in a very, very skillful way. And I think that is largely due to their backgrounds, their big vision, their geopolitical understanding.
Another area, of course, that's very important is that, which is a great advantage to democracies, is that the chiefs of staff are not scared. They are able, people like Alan Brooke and George Marshall are able to put their opinions to Churchill and Roosevelt, and indeed each other, in a way that is bound by the normal democratic Western open ways of discussion. So you're under no danger that you're going to be sent to the Lubyanka if you say something that the dictator doesn't like, and that's a tremendously important thing in war. In fact, we're probably seeing, aren't we, in the Ukraine war now, Putin being told things that are not true because the person who's telling them doesn't want to tell him bad news. Yeah.
I mean, that collegiate style is which is essentially what we're talking about, is very striking on the Allied side, isn't it? Where, I mean, although obviously you have people worrying about their careers and being sacked, but that's the extent of it, rather than Hitler running his army, his field marshals on packets of land, bribery, field marshals' batons, and all that sort of stuff, and turning those things on and off. Turning the tap off on bribery and promotion when they don't perform. And you look at if you're a German general who's sacked, you're probably rehired within 9 months anyway, because Hitler's gone through his Rolodex. Because all right, we'll have to get Model back in. That happens. Whereas the Allied, if you're an Allied general, if you've messed up, you tend to get. The British Army gets sent to India generally. Flicked over to India. But that collegiate style comes right from the top, though, doesn't it? Is that for all of Churchill's sort of forcefulness as a person, he's prepared to do that, which is eternally to his credit.
Yes, especially as he's made himself Minister of Defence, of course, in May 1940, as well as being Prime Minister. So he had the constitutional right to preside over the Defence Committee of the War Cabinet in both roles, and so he would sit there as Alan Brooke broke pencils in half in front of his face, saying, "No, I disagree with you, Prime Minister." Crack. back, which must be extremely off-putting to have a sort of 6'2" Ulsterman breaking a pencil in front of your nose. And of course, Alan Brooke also, members of his family had fought at Gallipoli, so he knew perfectly well that when Churchill makes a mistake strategically, it can be a hell of a mistake, and he knew that from personal sort of family experience. So yeah, he was held back from doing lots of things that he wanted to do, that the chiefs of staff essentially stopped him from doing, and yet it never broke their connection. There was one moment where all three of them considered amongst themselves that they were going to threaten to resign, which is in March 1944 over the North Sumatran plan. But other than that, they came to strategy as the result of logical and rational debate. And that's not what's going on in the Wolfschanze, 1,800 miles behind the Russian front.
Right, we need to take a very quick break now. We'll be back in a second. We're talking to Andrew Roberts about Winston Churchill. Welcome back to Weird Ways of Making You Talk with James Holland and me, Al Murray. And we're talking to Andrew Roberts about Winston Churchill. I mean, who else to talk to, in all honesty? Now, Andrew, one of the things, we've been talking around Churchill's leadership style, the idea that he's a man of destiny. One thing he most definitely is, though, and I'm happy to use this word loosely because I get called a historian, and I'm not. I'm a consumer of history. I'm a person who likes it. I would never ever describe myself as a historian. But Churchill, so much of where Churchill comes from, this strategic sense James is talking about, his ambition for what the Allies can achieve, comes from being a historian, doesn't it?
Yes, undoubtedly. He saw himself as a historian, or at least as a writer. He started as a journalist, of course, but the journalism that he did, especially the war journalism, tended to be about issues that were historically important. He wrote several serious history books. Actually, I've got all of his first editions, many of them signed, just here on my shelf here. And when I look across, I see the River War, I see his First World War books, which of course were semi-autobiographical, but they were also, he wrote about London to Ladysmith and the Boer War. His life of Marlborough is still, by many, considered the best life of one of the greatest, some argue the greatest British soldier ever. So we've got a corpus of historical understanding and knowledge. The number of times, I went through them once, his 1940 speeches, some 10% of them are given over to history. He uses history as a way of trying to basically tell to the British people, yes, this is a completely nerve-wracking and terrible time. However, we have been here before. In fact, we've been here before in 1588 and in Louis XIV's time and in the First World War, of course, and with Napoleon, and we've come out well each time, victorious each time. So put it into its proper historical perspective, these terrible, perilous times. And so being a historian, actually, I think you're absolutely right, Al, is epicentral to understanding who he is.
But also, he's not, although he's a historian and very conscious of the past, he's also a modernist as well, isn't he? He embraces modernity and he surrounds himself with technocrats, whether it's Lord Charwell, whether it's Oliver Littleton, later Lord Chandos, etc., etc.
Yeah, and he loves writing articles all the way through the 30s. He's writing articles about how a bomb the size of an orange could take out a city. This is years before nuclear scientists have actually come anywhere near being able to do that. But he learns from physicists who he invites to Chartwell during the 1930s about what is the capacity of that science has to change warfare, and not just warfare, also various other aspects of human life. So you have somebody who's constantly questing. But my sense is that that's partly because he was interested in the past and history, because he recognised that the successful people in the past have been the ones who embrace change and embrace science and modernity.
Yeah, and track progress, because I mean, if nothing else, his political arc is so peculiar in terms of he's absolutely on the forefront of and a lot of people will fall off their chair to hear that he was at the forefront of the idea of the welfare state, essentially, with national insurance before the First World War,
and labour exchange.
Exactly, that he's completely intimately tied up in that stuff. Whereas that people think, oh, it's about sending tanks to defeat trade unionists, well, you know what I mean, because so much of his political career is used as a football rather than actually what did he do in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think it's nice of you to say an arc, as though it has a sort of natural trajectory. Because it is, of course, it's a roller coaster, isn't it? It's absolutely a roller coaster that you have no idea where it's going to go next. Sort of roller coaster in the dark, almost.
But I mean, by the time because most people, if they get to Chancellor of the Exchequer, and then their political career doesn't work out, that's normal. That's a usual political trajectory for people, isn't it? That they maybe get that far, and then they I don't know, they go into business, or they go into journalism, or whatever it is, or they go to the House of Lords. Actually, is what traditionally happens. But because he's a young chancellor, he's a tyro politician to a lot of people, isn't he? So what was he ever going to do after the end of that first phase of his career?
Well, a lot of people, of course, thought that was the end, including his wife at one point. In fact, it's very difficult to see anyone at all in the 1930s who, there's one person, but other than that, nobody thinks that he's going to be Prime Minister. And that one person is Churchill himself. He's the only person who doesn't give up hope in Churchill. There are very few people, Bob Boothby, you could mention, Harold Macmillan slightly perhaps, a few others, Brendan Bracken certainly, who think that he's in with a chance if something extraordinary happens, but it would take a world war. And then a world war comes along, Yeah. And this is the key thing. And this is, of course, the reason that I subtitled my book "Walking with Destiny," because his phrase that he comes out with in the last part of the first volume, The Gathering Storm, the first volume of his memoirs of the Second World War, he says that I felt as if, speaking of the 10th of May 1940, I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And so all of his past life, the bit where he was Home Secretary, the bit where he was Chancellor that we mentioned earlier, especially the bit, of course, when he was not once but twice First Lord of the Admiralty, these were all preparations he considered for this extraordinary moment of 1940.
Yes, I mean, did you when you sat down to write about it? Do you have to struggle with the idea? He's sort of too big, isn't he? In a way, he's
Yeah, I knew at some stage that I was going to write this book, but I rather put it off to I thought it was going to be something I'd do at the end of my writing career when I was in my 70s, rather than do it when I was in my 50s. But my wife and my publisher and my agent said, no, you've got to do it whilst you're still, able to, and as soon as possible. And I'm very pleased I did, not least because it did allow me, first of all, of course, the Royal Archives coming available, but there were 47 other sets of archives that had been deposited at Churchill College, Cambridge, that I was able to use, that had been deposited since the last major biography of him, Roy Jenkins' one. So I knew that there was going to be plenty of new stuff, especially the papers of people like Ivan Maisky, the Russian ambassador, who I knew that there were lots of these papers that if I didn't use them, some other biographer was going to. And you know that feeling, don't you, James? You come across something and you think, oh my gosh, I've got to sort of pounce. And in my previous book, Masters and Commanders, I had discovered the verbatim accounts of the War Cabinet, and so I wanted to use them as well to sort of tie in.
Which are amazing, aren't they? Yeah, because it's so in the moment. I mean,
exactly. Yes, that's right. And I came across those one Friday evening waiting for a train, and they were in hieroglyphics and shorthand, and I'd never and I didn't know what they were. And once I'd deciphered them and used them for that book, I thought this needs to actually be put in the context of a biography. Not just a normal history book.
Gosh.
And what about Andrew? What about his amazing character? I mean, I never forget one of the best accounts I've ever heard of Churchill in action was in Oliver Littleton, who I mentioned a minute ago, in his autobiography, his memoir, and he talks about Churchill sort of taking a bite of steak pie with one hand, and then a chocolate truffle, and a swig of champagne, and then a glug of claret, and then a brandy, and it's all happening at once, and at the same time he seems to be talking non-stop, which is somehow impossible because he's eating and drinking at the same time. and you do get this incredible larger than life image sort of appearing, and I mean, what did you make of him and his enormous capacity for work and just life? I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it, really?
Yes, I think...
that's not exaggerated, is it?
It's not in the slightest. No, the Chandos memoirs are absolutely superb on that aspect, that sort of, life-enhancing, trying to grab every moment kind of aspect of Churchill. It's born of something, not just his belief in his destiny, but also a tremendous energy, a sense of not having much time, which seems extraordinary considering he lived to be 90, but most of his uncles and aunts died in their mid-40s. His father died at 45, and so he thought that he wasn't going to have much time in his life to achieve the things that he needed to, and so he was turbocharged for that reason too. Plus, he had the most enormous sort of weight on his shoulders. First of all, his father had been Chancellor of the Exchequer. And also, his great ancestors, the Duke of Marlborough, the classic one, he's born at Blenheim Palace. He couldn't just be a nobody or a also ran, because he would be seen in light of them. So he was driven also by this sort of dynastic sense too. So I think there are lots of psychological things going on with Winston Churchill. Not, however, and I'm sure we will get onto this at some stage, might as well mention it now, Black Dog. I don't think he was a manic depressive. I don't think he could have chaired 900 meetings of the War Cabinet between 1940 and 45 if he had been a true manic depressive, which is a debilitating illness and something that would have made that impossible. He got depressed at times. When Al was talking about 1942, he got depressed at the fall of Singapore and the fall of Tobruk and so on. But any normal sentient being would have got depressed when
yes, and
like
there's moments, aren't there, where at the end of the day he goes to bed with with one of his close colleagues, and they sit in silence, and they're both feeling so sick with worry and all the rest of it. But that's, as you say, because it's an incredibly tense and scary time. Yeah, and you've got to make these incredible decisions.
Yeah. And there's also a moment where he can't eat, where he and Anthony Eden, they've just sent, I think it's St. Valerie or something to do with the 51st Highland Division, I think, or was it maybe Calais, where they couldn't eat lunch because they'd essentially sent men to their doom and knew it.
I think it was the Calais one, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an awful moment. So that, which is not something that either Stalin or Hitler would. I mean, neither of them were ever put off their meals by the idea of sending men to their doom.
His wife wrote to him at one point saying, "You're becoming a bully," didn't she? And said, "You're losing control of yourself and you're alienating people."
Yes. She was great at those kind of letters.
So reining him in a bit, didn't she? She used to just sort of tick him off.
Everyone's always taken her side of the view and sort of assumed that is right. But she was ticking people off the entire time, and he was no exception. But also, if there's yes, I mean. Today, of course, it's impossible to bully your civil servants, but when the fate of the nation's in your hands, and also it's back in the 1940s when you didn't have that kind of attitude, then people sort of put up with it a bit more. And so, yes, he could be extremely tough on people. But there is no example of anyone who worked closely with him ever say they all write about it, but none of them complain about it. They all perfectly understood that under the stresses and the strains that he was under, it was entirely human and natural for him to respond like that occasionally, and what he would always do afterwards. And you see this again and again in great men. Actually, you see this with Napoleon as well, and several other people. Is that he would make sure that in some way or another, the next time they met, he would not actually verbally apologise, but he would make it clear that he didn't hold any grudge, that he was sorry, but he never said sorry, as it were.
Gosh, I feel rather we're talking to the oracle here, Andrew. So I've so many questions I want to ask. What do you think he regarded as his biggest errors during the war? Because after all, strategically, the British got their way, didn't they? All the way through the war, and
no.
Well, I'd say we don't go to Normandy until 44. The sort of chivying of the Americans into strategic positions that the British would prefer to adopt. Maybe that's a better way of putting it.
No. We do. I think up until D-Day. I think after that he was opposed to Operation Dragoon, Anvil down in the south of France. He wanted a Balkan attack that was going to liberate Vienna before and push into the Balkans to stop the Red Army from taking Eastern Europe, and he was stopped from doing that. And actually, by the way, Alan Brooke was against that as well. The Chief of Staff didn't want that either, and so that wasn't going to happen.
So was Jumbo Wilson, to be fair, as well.
Yes, no, they was not going to happen. But it's not as though he got everything that he wanted, and there were lots of things. There was a Northern Norway attack that he wanted, which would have been incredibly costly. So there were. I mean, again, going back to Alan Brooke, he once said that Churchill had 10 ideas a day and he had to shoot down 9 of them.
Yeah.
But it's not bad to have one good idea a day, is it?
Well, I mean, it would be a start. But what's so fascinating though is that he was prepared to give to Alan Brooke, wasn't he? He was prepared to concede, which I think is. When we think of the popular conception of his characters, he's stubborn, that he held his ground, that he knew best, and all that sort of stuff. But that he was prepared to concede is really essentially how the British strategic war effort was successful, isn't it? Is that he?
Yes.
I mean, we touched on this earlier, but it's the absolute core of how it worked.
Yes, but he did need to see that all 3 of the chiefs of staff were opposed to whatever it is he wanted. He was very adept at using his eloquence, of course, and his humour and his good nature, but also clenched fists on the table and shouting and so on to try to get at least one of them, be it Portal or Pound, to break off from the overall decision of the 3 of them. And it was, in a sense, Brooke's genius that never happened, and that they only ever gave advice, the 3 of them together. And he was very much primus inter pares, really, as well as, of course, being chairman of the chiefs. And Churchill did have that sense that if he could only break off one of the chiefs against the other 2, then he would be in a position to see his policy get through. But what he for some reason never seemed to clock was that just prior to going into a meeting of the Defence Committee, Brooke would square the entire agenda with Pound and Portal, later with Cunningham, to make sure he didn't. That this did not happen.
Yeah. Yeah, because he did go through a frustrating phase, or a frustrated phase, where he wanted to know why his generals wouldn't fight, and why the army couldn't get its act together, and useless mouths and all that sort of stuff. When does he catch up with the sort of the tactical and therefore strategic realities of what the army The army, because it's the army in particular, what the army's actually capable of.
Well, it actually goes beyond that, of course, because there's that famous phrase about how you can, talking about the chiefs of staff, how you can take the most valiant airman, the most the bravest soldier, the most dashing admiral, and what do you have when you put them together? The sum of their fears. Which is a terrible thing, really, to say about the chiefs of staff in the Second World War. You know, they were not fearful. They were not fearful. They were cautious at times when you needed to be. You know, when one looks at what the British armed forces went through in the Second World War, it was right to be cautious for a lot of the time. But to answer your question, it's really Alamein. I think after Alamein, you don't get quite so much of this consistent criticism of every aspect of the army. What you do get, of course, is the same kind of criticism during the Mediterranean campaign, especially of the Americans. You know, where he goes, the Americans won't move until they've got their hairdressers and the Coca-Cola bottling department. So on, you know, and I've counted up that there need to be 17 men behind every fighting man, and you know it should be the other way round, and all this, and so he transfers a lot of that natural sense of frustration and irritation, especially after Anzio, from the British Army onto the American forces.
But Andrew, I just wanted to just touch on both vision and oratory, because I think the two are obviously so clearly linked. And I suppose to go back to 1940, I mean, you think about some of those speeches, whether it's the 18th of June or whether it's the 4th of June or later on in August, or the big famous ones. I mean, you've got something like 64% of the entire population of Great Britain listening. You know, if you think that and then sort of take out sort of 20% children or something. I mean, it's just an incredible proportion of the adult population and listening.
Yeah, it was all down to pubs. You know, it was all down to pubs. It was the fact at 9 o'clock everyone went quiet and listened. The landlord would turn it up and everyone would go quiet and listen. You know,
but what he's conveying is a sense of self-belief, of confidence, of yes, we're in a critical situation, but actually we've got lots in our favour. It's a vision for the war. It's a vision of how to get through, and that unifying factor. It sort of sounds unfashionable today, isn't it, to kind of sort of over-egg that particular bit? But I always felt, whenever I've kind of studied Churchill in any detail, that was a really, really important factor. That is a big part of his chemistry. Is this sense of selling a vision, selling a view, using words and what I was saying earlier on about that geopolitical understanding to kind of get the country behind you, which I think, broadly speaking, he does.
That's right, but a lot of it, frankly, is not rational. I mean, when you read it together, when you read it today, and you see the stuff about, oh, there's going to be a bad harvest in Europe, there's going to be an uprising in France, the Americans are about to come in any moment. You know, there's one argument after another that he makes that are completely wrong. You know, that don't hold any kind of water, and you'd have to be immensely, even in 1940, immensely. About to say naive, that's the wrong word, but optimistic to go along with these ideas. I mean, what about the ones about great French counterattacks in sort of June 1940? There's no chance of that happening, and Churchill knew it. So you have a plus. Of course, he exaggerates the number of U-boats being sunk to the most by huge margins, and of course he does, because it's about morale. It's about a chance of grabbing at any straw that you can think of in order to keep morale high, and he did it, and it was successful. And you know, the truth in war has to be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies, or at least a bodyguard of exaggeration, and so on. And in a sense, that was sort of part of his greatness. And I wonder whether or not, had we had a Halifax or a Chamberlain carrying on that war, whether or not they would have exaggerated the very slight positives and ignored the negatives to the extent that Churchill did. You know, I think you needed somebody who throughout his life did not mind exaggerating to get us through that.
I mean, that after all is one of the great questions around Churchill is where does the rhetoric, the public rhetoric, sit. It sits hugely in people's imaginations. But I mean, you look in mass observation, you get people saying, "Oh, here he goes again. It's another one of his harebrained speeches that's supposed to rouse us." But then that's also arguably the nature of who's doing mass observation and what mass observation is. But
for those who don't know, mass observation was a kind of sort of polling of people. It started off in the 1930s as a sort of social experiment to see what ordinary people were thinking on a day-to-day basis, and they got people to keep diaries and stuff, and they then did polling. But obviously, once the war began, it took on a kind of whole different level.
Yeah, and it's not polling in the sense of Gallup polling, because and when you look at the only polling that was done, which is Gallup polling, Churchill never dips below 78% approval ratings. On three occasions he gets to 93. He averages 80. These are numbers that have never been seen before or since.
Yeah,
that's incredible, isn't it?
it
absolutely is incredible.
It certainly is. Yeah. James. This has been fantastic, Andrew. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I mean, I almost feel like we need to get some questions from the listeners and have you back at some point to go through what they want to talk about, because we mentioned it earlier. It's so big, and he's so big, and he's so central to whether people like it or not. I mean, that's the thing about Winston Churchill. Whether they like it or not, he's central to the story of the Second World War. Whether they like him or not, that he is, it's a fact of life.
I'd be very happy to come back on and answer any questions from anyone who has read the book.
Well, having said that, if you do answer some questions, you might get more people buying the book as well.
Even
more than have already bought. Even more who've already bought it. But yeah, no, it's been great having you on, though, Andrew. Thanks so much for doing this.
You are kind. I much enjoyed it. Bye, guys. Thanks
very much. Cheerio, everyone. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.